The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Integration Podcast, where we are continuing our effort to bring together big picture models and wherever possible, also the people who are working on those models or developing those models for the purposes of sort of broader integration and comprehensive synthesis and consilience. I'm Brendan Graham Dempsey, managing editor of the Integration Journal, joined by editor-in-chief Nick Hedlund, and I'll introduce our guest in a second. But really excited to continue this effort that we've been engaged in, where the research forums that we've been doing through the Institute are serving as sort of an initial offering for a set of ideas as a welcome into these different big picture models. And then we're deepening into those conversations with this podcast format. So today we've got Dr. Gregg Henriques with us, who just presented on his unified theory of knowledge model, the UTOK model, and would love to use this opportunity to deepen into that. And Gregg focused our attention on sort of the big picture of his big picture in that presentation. Would love to use this opportunity to dig into a few things or surface some things that maybe didn't get into in that context. But first, thanks, Gregg. Appreciate you not only in your presentation, but also taking the time to do this deeper dive.
Lovely. It's really wonderful to be here. I appreciated the opportunity to put the presentation together because I love what's going on here. I think the integration as a verb thing is a beautiful framing. It took me an opportunity to kind of situate UTOK and the ecology of kind of big picture thinking and to try to find the vibe of how to communicate UTOK, but do so in a way that opens up conversation and cooperation, synergy, dialogue with other systems. So it's great. I love the original document, and it'll actually made my presentation come together, I think, even tighter. So it was a cool thing, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, let's kick us off with this, because one of the things we can do in these podcasts is add in more content that maybe didn't get surfaced in the forums. And so you did an awesome, again, like 30,000 foot overview situating UTOK as part of natural philosophy and as part of this project that we're engaged in. But I also felt like it'd be helpful for people to hear some of the aspects of the model that you didn't necessarily spend a lot of time unpacking. So we'll just start there and take how much time you will. But I thought in particular, the tree of knowledge image and that framework is so compelling. It's so strong. There's so much in there. And I think that for me, that's one of the really, really significant aspects of the UTOK model and what it offers. And so I was hoping maybe you could spend a few more minutes unpacking that diagram and what's going on there, specifically getting at sort of what are these cones that are showing up here. What are these different joint points that we're seeing? What are these different theories that are being mentioned and all of that? So maybe you could take a little bit and sort of unpack the tree of knowledge diagram for us.
Absolutely. Happy to do it. So, there's 4 upside down cones. You have to get your hands on it. It's easier to see it but as I discuss it. So if we take a zoom and take a look at sort of what happened in the 20th century, I think there was a consolidation, at least on the outline of our cosmology. And that is, with Darwin, we see an evolutionary perspective, but it wasn't until the 20th century that we realized that the universe itself sort of evolves from a Big Bang kind of thing. And that essentially, I would argue, gives us a very core 2-axis structure of understanding sort of a scientific cosmology that says there's a time by complexity axis. And I call that the big history model. And it's a basic schematic that I think almost all big pictures, at least, kind of gravitate towards in some way or the other. And the tree of knowledge is situated within that, but it also makes a couple of points about it. And that is that the general time by complexity model can be mapped a wide variety of different ways. Many of those would be potentially useful, but we want to be very clear about what we're talking about and what the map is designed to do. So the 4 cones of complexification that the tree of knowledge says, it says that what I am tracking is the specific path of complexification, specifically behavioral complexification. Complexification is the way parts turn into wholes, and wholes then turn into groups in an integrated differentiation that results in a metastable whole. So it's specifically the way elements are coming together. And certainly somebody in integral theory, we see holons, which are very closely related to this. But it is very important that complexity in general is a complicated term. Complexification is about the integration, differentiation to give rise to a metastable whole. So that's one point. Tyler Volk makes this point very key, that we want to be clear that we're tracking the integration of parts that go from the Big Bang to us. If we're in the sense that things like galaxies may be thought of as a kind of complexity organization, certain solar systems, the Earth itself, but those aren't the parts that actually constitute us. That are often the parts that we're contextualized in. And so we want to be able to separate what is it actually that's going to constitute us. Tyler Volk calls that the trail of combigenesis. And that's then the specific trail, say, from atoms. We are made up of atoms and the molecules. We're made up of cells. We're made up of organ systems. We're not made up of the sun. We take energy from the sun. So that's just the difference of like, what is the complexification parts? And so UTOK aligns with that, or the tree of knowledge aligns with that specifically. And then it does something very different than other systems. And that is, not only does there a progression of levels of complexification, but the visual itself gives us this articulation that it's dimensions of complexification on top of levels. So it's not just levels, which virtually everybody has at various kind of angles, but it's levels and dimensions, where the dimensions is a different kind of thing. Actually, Tyler Volk himself saw this when he was doing his combigenesis. Actually, there's these big realms. And we see this in a number of different areas where people see, oh, there's matter, that's one domain. And then life, that's another domain. And then we get human culture, and that's a third domain. And virtually all, when people zoom out and they see the sort of the threads of the patterns of complexification, they divide them loosely into these big territories or realms. But the tree of knowledge says something very specific and different. And it says that actually these realms are actually 4, not 3. And following matter, I can talk about the emergence of matter, which is its own particular kind of dimension relative to what I would call the energy information implicate order. That's a whole nother set of questions and discussions. But really what I want to focus on now is the difference between matter into life, which is a different cone of complexification represented by a different dimension in the diagram. And then life into mind, specifically the life organism into mind animal, and then finally mind animal into cultured person. And it offers really a theory of emergence here that's novel. And what it says is there's a new causal regime that is arising when we shift from matter to life. And the reason is not just because there's information processing within cells, although that is happening and that is important, but it's also the case that there's communication networks that are forming. So it's information processing and communication networks that create an ecology. And what it says is that this is a new causal regime because the communication between systems is abstracting macroscopic forms and then communicating the macroscopic forms through lines of information interface, where the macroscopic form now is completely separated off of and then metabolized by a novel entity that is not really instantiated in the same sort of reductive way that is when it is operating on the system. Okay, so if I say, hey, if I communicate to you, hey, this is what the tree of knowledge is, this is all the way up in propositional language, but it's communicating a macroscopic form and then sending that macroscopic form to you, and then that's a separation. And then that has causal form in its macroscopic form that's separate from its instantiation at the microscopic level. Okay, networks. What you're getting is a very different kind of causal process. That's why I call them a different causal regime. And then you get a different kind of top-down structure where the communicative networks are creating constraints for energy information flow that are fundamentally shaping the form and function of that. And that really then becomes a fundamentally different kind of emergence. And that's why it's represented in a different cone. Put it another way, weak emergence says basically it's one cone, a bunch of levels where we can really stack the levels in a pretty reductive way. Strong emergence imagines almost an unbreakable kind of cone, or at least sort of mysterious strong emergence. UTOK says it's sort of a intermediate level, but says there are causal regimes They're arising, though we can understand them as they're arising as functional awareness, functional information processing communication networks. There's a process by which forms are getting abstracted, shared in a kind of a mutual information way. And that's given rise to why we see living cells behave so differently than inanimate matter, why animals then behave. Because the other thing that it says is there's different problem spaces and novel forms of information processing and communication happening at higher levels of complexification. So last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up. I know I've said a lot here, but you get cells operating on, say, DNA, RNA kinds of bits of information communicated across chemical gradients, creating opportunities for metabolism, survival, reproduction. Those are the sort of functional problems they're solving. They get animals into 3D behavioral space. I take this off of Mike 11, but basically they get up and move around as wholes. They get mediated through the nervous system and their complex active bodies, and they communicate to each other. That's a different level, a higher order level of information processing communication. And then at the culture person plane, you get us as a particular kind of primate that's using symbolic propositional communication networks, give rise to yet another dealing with the problem space of justification through a novel form of information processing communication, gives rise to another plane of existence. So I'll pause there, and I know I said a lot, but
yeah, let me repeat a little bit of that back and see if I'm getting all that. And I'll start there. I mean, so these are these planes, these cones represent novel information processing regimes and networks of communication that are sort of using those information processing regimes. And so as you get these emergent levels, what you're seeing are novel kinds of ways of processing information and then relating different kinds of behavioral phenomena one to the other. And so that's what you're seeing emerge across complexification time, as it were, and that's what the tree of knowledge is diagramming. So yeah, I think, thank you. That's really helpful. The other thing that, if you want to just take another couple of minutes to unpack, or then how these relate to those specific theories at each of those joint points, because I think this is also really an important part of the UTOK model of trying to understand what's unique then about how these things can be understood on their own terms with different kinds of theories relative to those information processing regimes. So yeah, say a little bit about that.
That's right. So you can then think about these things as sort of, there's tunneling processes that give rise to the capacity of this system to grow an organized ecology. So what would be the underlying causal processes that would enable a system to do that? And if we go back to biology and consider in the 20th century what became called the modern evolutionary synthesis, we see the outline of a particular kind of way of thinking about this, which is that there's genetic replication that's being housed in certain cells across generations that creates what biologists identified sort of as a population of genetic potential organized into cells that are surviving and reproducing. And then what you have in that context, of course, is an evolutionary process where the cells are propagating across a wide variety of sort of variation elements. There's selection about who survives and reproduces. And then there's retention of complexification into adaptive design space that allows for entities to have the capacity to survive, to grow, and to reproduce. And then that is then the underlying complexity building feedback loop, a variation. Really, there's a propagation element and then a variation, selection, retention feedback loop into a problem space that wasn't present before, that gives rise to ever-increasing sort of an engine of production of complexification. And that's the modern evolutionary synthesis in a nutshell. I don't think it's a complete theory of biology by any stretch, but it is actually a way to think about kind of the engine of the production of the life dimension of complexification. And it's a universal process of kind of creating complexities, this variation, selection, retention loop. And the tree of knowledge says that each one after life is the same basic process operating in a different problem space on a different information processing system with a different communication network feedback loop. But nonetheless, you get a variation, selection, and retention. Now, I'm a psychologist, as people know, and one of the things I've been fascinated about with the problem of psychology is the difference between behaviorism as it evolved over the years from Watsonian classic behaviorism into more modern forms, most notably Skinner, and the emergence of the cognitive revolution as an information processing model that the nervous system is processing information. And then we get a computational functional idea about how that works. Well, back when I built the tree of knowledge system, And I was seeing the parallels that there are these different systems, and oh, hey, it's a new information processing system. And when we looked at the the evolutionary synthesis, we see there's an environmental selection operating on sort of a digit of information to create this organization. Well, if you go up a level, then you can really argue that actually, if you know B.F. Skinner's work, he identified himself literally as the Darwin of psychology at times. And operant theory is a selection theory, meaning that there's a variation in what an animal does and the effects that it has. Certain effects are then selecting for certain, they're the operants that are selecting for particular types of behavioral patterns. And operant selection is a within animal learning system that takes place during the course of the animal's life that explains the complexification of behavioral repertoires. That's what it does. Now, Skinner eschewed the idea that the nervous system could be thought of as an information processing system, but I just think he was wrong. I mean, there'd be a lot of reasons why he did it, but I don't think it's actually a good argument. If we break the information processing system into units and then think about how are these organizing and being bound together to create opportunities for then the agent as an operator to operate in the world, and then we see a particular kind of like variation, a potential, a selection, and retention of building of complexification. John Vervaeke, our famous cognitive psychologist friend, talks about the cognitive processes of recursive relevance realization exactly as a variation, selection, retention process. I like to call them as the inner Skinner. Okay, but the point of it is that information processing bound to selection patterns in new problem spaces gives us a variation, selection, retention for the emergence of the animal-minded dimension of existence. And so you see that propagation through exactly the same kind of, at least, overall structure of a complexity building feedback loop built on propagation of potential into a variation, selection, retention problem space, namely the mind-animal dimension of complexification and the way animals navigate through sensory motor loops, navigate their environment and move as wholes in relationship to each other. And then finally, my core insight that started, that set the stage for the tree of knowledge itself was the idea that there's a propagation of propositions. Once humans are talking symbolically and then creating meaning, there's a tipping point of meaning-making systems. Those meaning-making systems create then propositions. Propositions make truth claims, positive truth claims. They open up negative space that then questions ask about. So you can make a claim, it has a value truth claim inside of it, then you can ask about the value, ask about the truth, and substitute alternatives in the problem space of justification. Well, actually, this then creates a whole nother area where you have an information unit that's propagating in a new selection pressure. It's got to solve the problem of justification. That means it's got to meet up with other units of justification. How do they bind together into complex systems of justification in an ecology where there's competing systems of justification, certain things getting selected for? Those things are more justifiable because they give more affordances around truth and value, about communicative structures, and other things are less justifiable, meaning that there's selection against them. So even at the culture person plane, we see a complexity building feedback loop, a novel functional information processing communication network, but nonetheless a similar kind of variation, selection, retention process that's generative in the new problem space, in this case, justification space.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And I'll real quick say some of that back and which is, so now you've got these cones of emergent information processing regimes and different communicative networks, matter, life, mind, and culture. And then each of these is sort of working in a kind of evolutionary dynamic of variation, selective retention. That's sort of happening at the genetic level in terms of sort of classic Darwinian evolution, but it's also happening at the psychological level in terms of sort of learned behavior, trial and error, selecting for behavioral patterns that work versus those that don't. So variation and selective retention. And then that's the minded level. And then culture level is where we're using symbolic information processing amongst other symbolic information processing people, and we're trying to sync up our justification systems in ways that also fully face selection pressures relative to the affordances that they open up and their adaptive or maladaptive aspects, and we're operating in those kind of pools of justification that are also seeing that. And so you get an interesting, fascinating recursive selection process happening across multiple levels of emergence, is how I'm reading what you're saying. Cool.
That's exactly right. And you can actually just insert somebody like Dawkins here. So he gets sort of the selfish gene. I think he overshoots selfish genes, whatever. But, genes are replicating systems and variation. He tells that story very well. He overlooks, as so many people do, sort of the variation, selection, retention of the animal and Skinner, but we can now insert John Vervaeke on the inside cognitive and Skinner on the outside environmental behavioral selection, say, oh, there's an inner Skinner animal mind variation, selection, retention going on. And he pointed to memes. Obviously, we introduced the term memes. Everyone uses that term nowadays, but obviously the history of this is Dawkins rhyming it with genes and saying there has to be some sort of replication, selection, retention process at the level of culture. So he throws that out there. I find memes themselves to be very, very poorly defined concepts. They almost are anything that replicates. They're very loose and not constrained in terms of at least intelligibility. But that's very different from justifications. Justifications are clearly defined. We can specify the mechanism and context by which those things are evolving and selecting, and we can make a lot of specification about human psychology and human culture in relationship to them. So if you substitute a meme, and that is an interesting concept, but if the kind of meme clearly that Dawkins was pointing to is a justification, and those actually have exactly the kind of network systemic variation, selection, retention properties that would give rise to a generative structure, and of course one that we can see, like right now, I'm trying to justify UTOK in the context of whatever systems of understanding exist.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. This is awesome, and the system you've developed is just such a potent synthesis, and it's such a great example of well, at least it starts out more of as a scientific metatheory, a metatheory beta, and it's scanning across the horizon of all these different theories and then systematically weaving them together into an overarching theory. And it's such a powerful synthesis, and it's so grounded in leading edge scientific findings from the mainstream academy. I think that's a real leg up that your system offers. There are other big history systems and integrated meta theories that don't necessarily make as much of an effort to really pay attention to the scientific literature and ground it in those fields. So I think you do an amazing job in that regard as well.
Thank you.
Very, very rigorous.
And
I'm also struck by kind of comparing your system to some of the other approaches that are out there. One way of sort of talking about it is that, you see this big history, evolutionary, emergent movement from the physiosphere to the biosphere to what we might call the zoosphere,
Yep.
and then into the noosphere. And the zoosphere, that doesn't get named typically in other big history type systems. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that aspect of the system, the mindedness element, and how that sometimes gets overlooked, and why is it that that's so important to not overlook that?
That is super. I really appreciate you highlighting that. For me, we have a very odd relationship with our animal mind sense. Okay, I'll start with the thing. Hey, humans aren't organisms. Does anybody ever raise their hand and say humans aren't organisms? Okay. Very few people. I don't ever remember hearing somebody really object to the idea that we're organisms. But humans aren't animals. Okay. Humans aren't apes. You hear that all the time. All right. And there's reasons for that. We want to be what's called cognitive dissonance. If something's close to you, but you really want to be different to it, then all of a sudden it's a threat. Cells are pretty far away from us, so we don't feel threatened by them. But apes, and of course, for racist tropes and other reasons, there's lots of reasons why, in colloquial terms, this is a dangerous concept that you're degrading in certain kinds of ways. But it speaks to something that I think is very, very profound in terms of what's missing in our common sense thing, is a reminder that we are primates. It's like this whole mystery about what is consciousness. Okay. Well, the hard problem that we're very aware of, the reason we're not philosophical zombies, isn't consciousness per se. It's primate consciousness. I mean, primate consciousness is where we know subjective conscious experience of being exists in any scientific way. Now, it could extend beyond that, but all of our reference, when I say I see yellow bouncing off of me in relationship to this, and I have an experience of what it's like to be in this conversation, the only answer to that is that's my primate-minded system. That's the only answer to that. Okay. When we ask, is AI conscious? When Richard Dawkins last month came out and said, well, I think Claudia is conscious. Dude, you realize then that you better be clear that we're conscious in a primate sense, and that's where all the hard problem stuff is. And there is no possible way, she said it herself, if you want to use those terms, that she's conscious in a primate sense. Okay? So primate consciousness is unbelievable, and we call this mindedness at a particular way. Mindedness gives a frame actually to define the relationship between us as a computational formal structure, which is non-subjectively conscious functional information processing, which is clearly happening in a lot of different domains. And then there's a special aspect of our mindedness, what we call the domain of mind two, that it gives rise to an ontological interior perspective. I mean, and that's where we know the ontology of interiority exists. We know we're not philosophical zombies, and there's some field of potential that emerges out of the neurocognitive architecture. Now, whether you could build something else that has that, that's a good question. But the only place we know that it happens is in the neurocognitive animal architecture. And almost certainly happens in birds and other things. But we'll say for us, we know it happens in the context of our primate architecture. That's where our perceptual experience of nonverbal being in the world, the feeling aspect of nonverbal being, and that doesn't change. I mean, that doesn't, just because we become persons that talk doesn't mean that the seeing, feeling, and experience of the world has changed from now isn't a primate. So primate consciousness is super important. It's super clear to be clear about the nature of what it is in terms of our everyday experience. And then we get into the academic structure of consilience. Okay. If we go to the other side and say, well, that's the way we should be talking about as folk psychology. You know, people should already know primate consciousness should just be part of our everyday experience. We shouldn't be, that's not an academic concept anymore to say then you're alive. You're a minded primate should be part of our everyday conversation. That kids should be knowing that in school. I never learned that in school, you know, but you learn, you know, you're alive. And I mean, nobody's scaring about that. You should be everyone should know you're a minded primate, and a cultured person. You don't stop being that. So that's a culture, worldview, everyday folks should be talking about this without confusion. And even if you're religious, you can't deny the claim that I'm an ape is different than the claim that evolution is the only cause. Right? I mean, if I'm what kind of organism am I? I'm an ape. That's the kind of organism I am. You have to acknowledge that and all the anatomy and physiology and everything we understand about the kind of organism we are. Now let's go over to the academic side and ask the question, well, how do we go academically? We're a bunch of academics. We're trying to create a meta theory of science, philosophy, gives rise to a coherent worldview. That's our alpha, beta, gamma structure. We talk about that. But if what meta theory is trying to do is do that coherently, then clearly the implication is between philosophy and science, we should be able to say, hey, physics goes to chemistry, right? Chemistry goes to biology. Biology goes to psychology, and psychology goes to the social sciences. Like, that's the complexity line. And we should actually be able to talk about each one of those jumps with what I call a basic gist ontology. A gist ontology is different than what Heidegger is doing in being itself. Okay, that's a really interesting, fascinating concept. But that's depth ontology, where ontology is pressing up against metaphysics, and we're trying to get at the ultimate existence of being, given how we know and what reality is, and what fundamental grounds we can say about the nature of existence and our knowledge of it and our being in the world. Fine, cool. When I talk about gist ontology, I'm like, kind of, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Like, in a super simple way, just tell me the center of gravity of the concept you're pointing to, okay? And what I've been trying to tell everybody for a long, long time that has gotten hidden is that when we move from biology and the science of living organisms and living processes, which extend into neuroscience, we have a gist ontology of what we're talking about. Like, we differ about what this virus is alive, how did it all happen, when did it happen, what kind of cause. Those are all deeper ontological questions. But the idea that a tree is alive and it's different from a rock, and that biologists study living processes is a gist that everybody agrees on. Okay? But when you step from neuroscience to psychology, we lose all basic gist grounding. And the reason is the field of psychology is fundamentally split across the behavior, mind conglomerate. It says it's the psychology of either behavior or mind or both, and there is no clear gist ontology that clarifies exactly what we mean by behavior, exactly what we mean by mind, exactly what we mean by mind and behavior studied by scientists. There's just, and then, by the way, how we understand that at the animal level, and then how we specifically understand those or interrelations at the human level. So science, behavior, mind, human relative to animal is actually a complete cluster of confusion. Okay, at the gist level, not at the and I'm fascinated by that fact. And what that means, if we are trying to build a meta theory of science and philosophy on the one hand, and then going back to folks in the world that are like, hey, I have primate consciousness, like all of that allows us to see at an operating system of understanding the basic shared reality that we live on. It's an incomplete, broken, fragmented operating system. It can't actually get a frame on what it's looking at that everybody agrees on and zoom into at least the shared gist of the reality that we're in. There's no gist ontology for psychology. There's no way to define mind in relationship to behavior. I think that's all part of a larger problem that emerges with science and what I call the Enlightenment gap. But I'm super passionate about it because I think you have to fill in the gist ontology of psychology. The only way to do that is to recognize there's a mind-animal plane that comes after a living organism plane into a culture-person plane. You have to understand these as different planes of existence. And then once you put those boxes in, now all of a sudden a gist ontology emerges. And then you can fill in a lot of clarity that's fundamentally currently missing. And if our goal is partly consilience between science, philosophy, and worldview, man, it's just a huge, important piece of the puzzle in that road.
Yeah, that's a great articulation of that, I think, in terms of what UTOK in particular is offering that's unique and novel and otherwise seemingly missing from some other models here. I want to pick up on a point though, because I find this a really interesting question. And this gets to starting to bring some of these models into conversation. So a couple of the frameworks we're going to be trying to bring together and into dialogue in this effort of ours include process thought and integral theory and some others. Those two in particular, though, work with notions that there's something, you can call it panpsychic or pan-experientialist, that there's something in a sense that goes all the way down. Whitehead talked about prehension. There's a whole kind of metaphysics there. Integral theory has a notion that there's a kind of interior aspect that goes all the way down. I'm curious how you're situating the mind layer where you do and how you think about that unfolding one to the next and thinking about consciousness in a particular way through the sort of minded animal primate vector that you're describing. Just curious about how you would then situate your UTOK model relative to those other framings. And one, if there's a way of thinking about that same question that those other models are talking about through a UTOK language, or how you might bring those two into a conversation.
Absolutely. So, I mean, remember what the UTOK emphasizes: ontological continuity and complexification. And you can actually think about that complexification in some ways as at least potentially tracking the emergence of interiority in the broadest definition. So we are at the ground level, and this would be, I definitely don't share anything that's a substance panpsychist argument in a deep way is something that's going to be quite different. There's sort of kinds of panpsychist arguments that UTOK is pretty, like integrated information overlaps. I think I disagree with some of the things that it says, but there's a picture of functional integrated information, or it's a way to describe UTOK as that. And it also can say that there's a particular organization of interiority at the inanimate matter level that is ultimately going to give rise to a potential for functional awareness and responsivity at the living level, which, by the way, I call consciousness 1, okay? Which is, there's not necessarily consciousness 2, which is subjective conscious. That's the what is like to be by Nagel and the heart seed of the heart problem. Functional awareness and responsivity means the entity's awake at some level and responsive, and that you see from the outside. And of course, living entities, just talk to Michael Levin, we are seeing living entities do this. The real question is, though, well, then is there anything like to be them? That becomes, then that's consciousness 2. And then consciousness 3 is self-conscious recursive awareness, which for us humans then requires a subjective mind 2 that has consciousness 2 properties that then as a self-recursive egoic justifier, that's what I term it as, that narrates what's going on in relation. So to get back to your question, here's the way I would put it. So that I like to think about a photon as consciousness impossible, okay? And what I mean by that is a photon's almost like 2 dimensions, okay? I talked to a physicist about this, but actually a photon, there's essentially no time and no space inside a photon. Like it just moves and then it's here and it's here. Nothing happened inside of it. There's really no interiority to a photon, or at least that's an argument that I've talked to them. If it doesn't have any ontological interiority, I don't think that it has anything that would be identifiable as conscious. Okay. But then you start to build the potentialities of interiority. Even in this regard, I would go into, from consciousness impossible, I go to consciousness zero. So consciousness, an atom is consciousness zero, but like it's a little bit more possible to have some sort of interiority in there than in a photon. Okay, so here you're going to get a bit of an ontological continuity of interiority potentials. Okay, that I think the panpsychists are kind of pointing to, and in that way, that functional integrated information potentials that then are binding, storing, creating what the IIT people call, these sort of causal integrated informational networks. That's got some kind of plausibility in it. If you keep stacking that, you go from basically consciousness zero impossible in the matter layer to consciousness zero all the way up to, say, 100, which then is going to flip over into life one, consciousness one, where like somebody like Terence Deakins talks about autogens. Autogens are precellular entities that are self-organizing, that are creating contragrade flow, that are getting more and more complexification, that are closer and closer to goal states, okay, that they're pursuing, which sort of had to have happened before we had cells. We had these entities. So these are inanimate entities, right, that are damn close to demonstrating all of that's the nature of ontological continuity. There's no magical spot where some other thing pops in. It's always got to be a series of recursive steps progressively. So you go from then consciousness zero, but at 100, that tips over into consciousness one at the very bottom of consciousness one. Then therefore you go to little bacteria cells all the way up to, say, networks of trees, right? Trees have unbelievable amounts of kinds of intelligences that they share. My body's got a lot of different kinds. It is functionally aware and responsive to survival reproductive problems in a very, very way I can't possibly understand, right? You get a cut on your arm and then all of a sudden it heals itself. It's a functional awareness and responsivity within the physiological structure. So that's conscious in the sense that it's got awareness. It's got functional capacities to solve problems. And I point to Michael Levin's excellent work to give us a really cool cutting edge landscape of all this stuff. But I don't think that there's anything like to be a tree in the hard problem sense. And I think that there's very good reason to believe that you get a second order kind of consciousness process when you get brains and complex active bodies in animals, and the kind of mindedness simulation that really consciousness two with this argument is that this says, hey, there's a different kind. So I will say this, I studied this now for a long time, this issue of consciousness, okay? And I realized that the hard problem is just poorly framed. It tries to do too much work, and it's got to be disambiguated. There's a philosophical problem, which aligns with what I call the enlightenment gap. This is a way to describe the nature of nature and place consciousness and mind inside of it at a descriptive landscape problem, okay? There's also what I call the neurocognitive engineering problem, okay? The neurocognitive engineering problem is the scientific problem that allows us to answer with detail and identify certain kinds of mysteries of the brain level, the neurocognitive level that's not conscious, and then the what I call mind two subjective conscious experience level. And how does that happen? Okay. So one thing I'll say to everybody is when you say, for example, I take a panpsychist view and that dissolves the hard problem, it transforms the way in which we think about the mind-body problem at the philosophical level. But it doesn't shift at all the neurocognitive scientific engineering problem. Like, you haven't changed the nature of what I would call mind two problems. Like, you don't answer, I can't call Phil Goff and be like, okay, great. Panpsychism all the way down. Now tell me exactly how the core reticular activating system powers the thalamus to create a recursive loop into the back and the frontal lane that gives rise to my conscious experience of being as a primate conscious. I have no idea. Right? I mean, it literally is useless. Those set of insights, as cool as they are, or how skeptical you might be of them, is actually completely irrelevant to the neurocognitive engineering problem. It's just not relevant at all. And that's one of my frustrations, is like we're talking past each other so much because the hard problem actually has a philosophical aspect that is relevant potentially for panpsychism and some of sort of your metaphysical and ontological categories of being and how you actually put them together at a descriptive, analytic kind of talk about way. Then there's actually the set of problems that somehow I woke up and then my system came online. There are a lot of mechanistic, interesting problems, regardless of whether you're a panpsychist or not, and actually claiming a panpsychism or not. So anyone ever says oh, I dissolved the hard problem, the reason we're not talking about this is a neurocognitive engineering problem. You don't just dissolve that. Everyone's going to be walking around with that problem. It's just the way we framed it. So those are some of the things I've talked now quite a bit, but bottom line is that there are ways to frame all of the major perspectives: idealism, panpsychism, property dualism. Substance dualism is the one structure that I've got an endo-naturalism versus exo-naturalism. I could possibly talk about how at least we could make sure we're talking about the same things. But materialism, physicalism, the work that I've done with John argues that really the term is naturalism. That's what we're kind of interested in. We're always going to be asking questions of continuity and discontinuity, emergence relative to reduction. All systems are going to have to deal with these kinds of issues. And I actually find a lot of the panpsychic stuff to be sort of misframing where the real meat of the conversation is, because we've misframed things like the hard problem.
Yeah, that's awesome, Greg. I love it. Yeah, you have so much to say about the hard problem, and you've been working on a so-called solution to the hard problem with John Vervaeke. Is that right?
Yes. So we actually then end up dissecting the hard problem, and it starts with this extended naturalism, which is the merger between John and I's frame as it applies to sort of the natural into cognitive social sciences to frame our full-fledged understanding of the stack from matter objects to living organisms, minded animals, and cultured persons, which then includes subjective conscious experience of being. We are not solving the neurocognitive engineering problem. Okay, so that's what we had to isolate that. We're boxing it in and shrinking it tremendously, but there's still lots of questions I can't answer. Like, for example, does a mosquito have a conscious experience of being, and how? Okay, I don't know the answer to that, and my conversations with John have not answered that, and that's a really interesting set of questions. I got a turtle. Is a turtle conscious, and how? Still don't know the answer to that. And after reading this book, you won't still know the answer. And there's certain ontological mechanism issues that I think warrant, quasi mysterious awe. I mean, there's good reason to, like, somehow I still, so I can lean into the awe. But also, it's also the case that over these 2-3 years of working on this, I realized how much more clarity I now have in talking about all of this. Okay, that is completely missing when I'm listening to the whole conversation. All right, so what we did is we then did a deep dive. I realized pretty early on that the hard problem was split between the scientific problem of how brains, neurocognitive architecture, and subjective conscious experience arise within that, versus how consciousness is possible in the physical universe. That's the mind-body philosophical problem that says, oh, this is how physicists understand the universe and chemists, and this is our mechanistic worldview from a scientific perspective, from a third-person perspective, and then we have this first-person experience of being. In fact, Phil Goff nails this when he says Galileo's error. Galileo framed the world as having objective mind properties and objective matter properties and subjective mind secondary properties. Galileo didn't just do this, but he used this, and science becomes this way. And this is part of then the grammar that we have to undo. So the tree of knowledge, actually, John's work on emergent evolution and my work on the tree of knowledge give us a way to frame emergence coherently and the ontology of nature that clarifies the big picture domain. So we argue that basically dissolves the enlightenment gap. And I can get into more details about how it does that. But the TOK gives us finally a picture. Says, here's what you mean by objective matter. Here's what you mean by subjective mind. Actually, here's the intersubjective justificatory context, which you also need. You need always objective, subjective, intersubjective vectors. They all can be bound in this perspective and give you a whole. Okay. So that gives you a way to frame the enlightenment gap as the nature of nature that enables us to see where consciousness arises. Then you bracket off the neurocognitive engineering problem. And then people that are familiar in this literature know a guy by the name of Neil Seth. He's actually now one of the big brokers in this. He won the consciousness articulation, essay contest for $50,000 explaining why AI wasn't conscious, which I'm going to now say why this shouldn't be surprising, or at least we should automatically have a language. So what John and I then did is say, Actually, when you have this frame, what emerges from our work is a structural functional articulation of the subset of mindedness. Okay, I'll say structural functional articulation of the subset of mindedness that would give rise to subjective conscious experience. Okay, I'll say this again. So like from a structural functional analysis, if you take John's work and my work, you put it together, and what that is actually emerges is what's called a perspectival epistemic portal. Okay, so there's a dimension of mind two, which is the inside out view, the subjective conscious experience, which is actually consistent of conscious contents being metabolized from a point of view that extends across time. Okay, and what the cortex and the thalamus really are doing is creating a little stadium that's tracking basically the self-interest across time from the perspective of the self as potential environments change. Okay, and then it's utilizing that as a model of mindedness as the non-conscious mindedness system is metabolizing functional awareness and responsivity in sensory motor loops. Okay, well, it's a long-winded way of saying is that this perspectival epistemic formal shows you the structural functional organization, and then it aligns that structural functional organization with properties, specifically qualia. Okay, qualia are the properties, so the secondary properties, and there's these big mystery properties, right? But what somebody like Chalmers does is he abstracts the properties and then throws them into the mystery. Like, oh my God, there's these miracle properties, they don't fit, and now they exist. Okay, and now we separate them from the mechanism of computational functionalism. That's what Chalmers did. But it's a mistake, because what you actually have to do is you have to set the properties up with the functional structural awareness at the first level. By the way, that's property of mindedness binds the structural functional processing of the nervous system as a non-conscious in the subjective sense. Okay, then you move up a level, and then there's the properties of subjective consciousness that then need to be tied to an emergent structural functional system. Okay, the emergent structural functional system that John identified and I identified is called PEP, which is Perspectival Epistemic Portal. And it's a theory then of the structural functional organization of mind, okay, that is modeling mindedness on a second order loop structure, all right, and then essentially is the binding of non-conscious cognitive contents into conscious contents through a subjective point of view. And then it gives you a much richer articulation of the properties that then are bound to the system, okay? What you see actually when you have this lens is, oh my God, people have separated the properties from the system across these two levels, and they have not given your 4x4. You need mind one, you need the structural functional organization with the properties, mindedness and consciousness one, and then you need to move up structural functional properties, PEP, perspectival epistemic portal, for consciousness two properties, subjective experience of being that involves experiencing the world from a point of view with valence, basically, okay? That's what those properties are. Then you're able to take that thing and stick it in here, okay? Go back to if somebody like Richard Dawkins had this and was like, what we mean by the hard problem is where do these properties come from and how do you fit it in a structural functional organization, at least just to talk about it. Our primate consciousness is a perspectival epistemic portal. That's what it is. Does AI have a perspectival epistemic portal? No, like not at all, like not even close. You know, it is a recursive predictive processing language machine. Okay, that's what it is. Now, whether that has recursive conscious awareness properties of some dimension, that's one question. But is it the source of the hard problem? If you have a perspectival epistemic portal, you immediately answer that question. You don't need a Neil Seth to write a very cool essay. You just say they don't have a perspectival epistemic portal. Why are we having this debate? Like, why are we having this conversation? Why is somebody smart like Dawkins confused about this? Because he doesn't have the language to separate the properties from the structural functional system, which when you have it, kind of like when you're missing mindedness, once you put this in, you're like, oh my God, it's like we're like, talk about clapping with one hand. We're completely wandering around this mystery because we're just not framing it correctly. So anyway, the perspectival epistemic portal, and the nice thing about the whole UTOK system is that it then says on top of that, of course, so you get this idea that on top of that is a narrator. So the cortex is building this, I like the stadium model. Basically what it's saying is focal resonance around conscious contents that then make self-relevant or task-relevant broadcasts. That gets into things like global neural workspace. And then what we have on top of that is a running propositional narrator. Okay, the ego, which is basically like announcing what it sees in the stadium, right? Okay, well, then that happened, and then you felt this way, and then you have your private narrator, and then your stadium broadcaster, okay, that then is connecting to everybody else's stadium. And what this does is say, oh, the cortex is the stadium that's modeling mindedness. The rest of the nervous system is engaged in the actual online motor in the loop. And then the narrator's telling the story. So you get mind 3 is narrating mind 2, which is modeling mind 1, which is rafting. This raft structure, it's moving the structure through the system. And all that, when you have that at a functional, phenomenological, organizational structure, you're good. You're good. And the one other thing I'll say about this that connects back to your original question, Brandon, is you mentioned process, okay? Process ontology. We got process thought. We have Jason Storm going, actually, the social process ontology. One of the big things that I've realized as I've been talking about psychology's missing gist ontology is what kind of ontology is it that's missing? A process ontology. That's what it is. And we can't make the contact between psychology's process ontology and neuroscience's substance ontology. Neuroscience actually binds to a substance ontology. And that's why it has then a horrible reductive problem. It closes its loop and says all of the causation is going to be in this little thing. And then it narrows itself. You have to take a process ontology and bind it to a substance ontology for a relational ontology of the whole. Well, what I realized, and then actually, this is one of those, you look back on how is psychology defined? It's the science of behavioral and mental processes. Like it's right in the original definition, and mindedness is a process structure. So actually, I can now say, hey, Jason, underneath your social process ontology that unifies there's this whole psychology mental process ontology. And then that's going to sit in a living process ontology that has continuity with the substance ontology. I think in his eagerness to bridge the enlightenment gap, my experience of Whitehead, and I am not a Whitehead scholar, that he shoots a little bit strong in the argument against a substance ontology, as if we have to choose between a substance ontology and a process ontology. I think he overshoots that. But here, what it says is certainly when we're at life, mind, and culture, the kind of ontologies we are talking about are process ontologies.
Yeah. Gosh, so much rich stuff here. What you just said is a lovely tee up to some of the strong capacities for synthesis and integration to not just Jason Storm's metamodernism, but also our process friends and Matt and Andrew are going to be involved in this as well. So there's a lot to be done there. I also, though, I want to throw in a question related to this, because I think this will be a really important area to try to work through. I think it'll actually, my anticipation is this will be one of the hardest needles to thread. So I just want to kind of double back to it, which is that I think, in Whitehead's kind of metaphysics, as I mentioned earlier, you've got that what some people read as a kind of panpsychic thing. And of course, in Wilbur and that form of integral theory, there's something similar. You've just done a great job, as I read you, is sort of saying, well, what we mean by consciousness has a structural functional element to it that it becomes a kind of, in a sense, a category area or just fundamentally kind of nonsensical move to say, there's consciousness without a nervous system and these kinds of things, because when we understand consciousness of that nature in this way, then that's like saying there's a coin with one side or something, right? It's like, well, that's an unthinkable sort of thing. So it helps clarify what we might be meaning when we often throw around loosely the word of consciousness. But one of the openings I'm interested in here is that there seems also to be some kind of intuition that the process theologians and the Whiteheadians are getting at, and the integralists are getting at, something around this other thing. And maybe it's just like a basal interiority that operates maybe in a term we can use apart from consciousness, but might still be part of the mix we could throw in here. And I'm curious how we might begin to theorize or imagine that. Something like you've gestured to these remaining mystery of how valence qualia are in some ways this different sort of thing that we're still confused by and awed by. So there's still a kind of opacity there that's sort of like, that's something there. And so questions open up like, is there something maybe all the way down at a basal level, let's just say at this kind of, maybe it goes all the way down into this energy information implicate order, somewhere at that level in the complexity stack that there's a kind of phenomenon there that winds up being maybe continually worked through or manifested in different forms as these other things that we tend to think about as consciousness in the way you're talking about come online, but have also been there all the way down there at the original state in some way. And we don't want to just call it consciousness because that could lead to the confusions that we're trying to move through. But is there some way that we could sort of gesture to maybe that's an interesting metaphysical possibility that we can disambiguate from consciousness as such, but there's some element that we might need to coin a new term for, but there's a way of trying to explore integrating that insight in its sort of ontology into what you're talking about is a really interesting question for me. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I'd love to dialogue with a lot of folks about it. What I point to through the tree of knowledge is basically there's the opportunity potentially for some sort of functionally integrative interiority to emerge. So if we take integrative information, some people are doing some interesting stuff in the mathematics of functional information, which is sort of things that can potentially get stored and communicated and processed all the way down the scale. So for me, the concept, at least that I would point to, is yes, we absolutely have ontological continuity. The tree of knowledge, if we take it seriously, is that there's a kind of functional complexification that's happening. If we think about what it's tracking the binding of things into entities. Those entities at some level, can be then said, certainly the nature of consciousness itself feels like it's defined by some sort of bound interiority that, the binding problem. There's a ontological interiority here. And to me, that ontological interiority at the continuity level is some sort of functional integrated informational structure. That's what gives it its continuity. That's what it is when before it's a subject of metabolizing this. These are functional informational units that are being deployed for overall awareness. Before that, they're nested in molecular structures. And then down. Then it gets really interesting to know if we solve the neurocognitive engineering problem, right? Then you can really potentially come in and say, well, actually, everything that we identify as the hard problem is finding itself in the jump from neurocognition into neurocognitive consciousness. Like that's where and it is this neuroelectronic binding of this particular stack at this particular point that gives rise to this thing. And this is where the add-on gives the qualitative difference of valence qualia experience, right? And before that just doesn't exist. Maybe that's the case, or maybe that thing, is that it sort of is a little bit like when the bacteria is moving towards it has some sort of embodiment that has continuity. That's very plausible to me. There's some sort of biological embodiment of doing, of consciousness one, meaning the functional awareness and responsivity of the whole entity, that somehow is bound together to create a continuity that say, see, yeah, that is consciousness all the way down. For me, those are interesting questions, but I also want to say, dude, the landscape sucks here. I mean, the landscape really sucks. I'd like us to get the landscape of the gross gist ontologies in accurate state, and then have me and have the players dialogue with each other with an adequate vocabulary and grammar, and then let's see where we end up.
That's great, Greg. Yeah, I mean, circling back on some of the things you said earlier, I think it's really powerful to see that there's these kind of category errors or confusions that are happening where there's a sort of philosophical question and there's more of a scientific question. The neurocognitive engineering problem is distinct from other kinds of philosophical mind-body problems or whatnot. And just clarifying that and naming that in the way that you did is very powerful. I think also just seeing that there are scientific metatheories and there are philosophical metatheories, and then there are the forms of metatheory that try and synthesize the two into a new kind of synthetic worldview that kind of is both scientific and philosophical. And from that frame, we also can understand science as a kind of form of philosophy, and you've been doing work around that of the natural, kind of reclaiming this idea of natural philosophy as not something that was just what science was before we termed it as science, but it's actually a more nuanced understanding of what we are actually doing in science anyway. And the project to try and integrate what we typically call science with this broader field of philosophy that can veer a bit away from the empirical and away from the natural, but still asking these questions in rigorous ways. So I'm curious if you want to say more about how you see UTOK in light of the kind of the alpha, beta, gamma distinctions, and how that distinction might be helpful.
Yeah, that's lovely. So it's been right. What is UTOK, right? That's and actually it really relates actually to the alpha, beta, gamma, I realized. A while ago, I was doing an encyclopedia entry after writing the book. It comes up in the book a little bit, but to think seriously about how to place UTOK, it zooms out into philosophy clearly. So UTOK really is a philosophical architecture. It says science is a part of philosophy, not that you'll ever reduce or turn philosophy into science. So it's a container. So this is why physics sits inside of philosophy, not the reverse from this vantage point. It's a kind of knowing. And UTOK is basically zooming out and trying to find the edges on the one hand of philosophy. It's binding to naturalism with a note to say there's something on the outside of that, potentially called exonaturalism. And then it then throws up its hand and says, I'll stop here. If people have theological insights or spiritual metaphysical insights that transcend this, great. I'm open to all the evidence and interesting things about this. I found the edges of my concern and I want to turn back. And then it brings into the science side, which is located at the behavioral cognitive science psychology level. What is this science of psychology thing? And how does it fit in the consilient network of sciences, which is, of course, a big picture philosophical question. But then it also asks very scientific questions at the level of what is the human mind and how does it fit and how do we map it and how do we stay consistent with empirical data. I built this thing that actually turns into a map of psychopathology. That's an empirical map called the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology. And it sort of stumbled into, this organizes why the personality disorders are over here and depression's over here and the anxieties over here and substance use are over here. And, oh, wow, that's really cool, right? That's empirical, meaning that we're making contact with measurement and patterns and reliable valid data. And I'm very interested then in a properly situated scientific psychology that also is nested and relating appropriately to human values and subjectivity. And this brings us to the worldview structure. And as you know, we got married a couple months ago, and I fell in love with Mossy, and she fell in love with me around UTOK. I mean, UTOK, for whatever reason, Mossy was able to see UTOK in all of its layers, or almost all of its layers that I layered out, and we loved it together. And I mentioned that because actually what that has come to see, what I've actually been living, I haven't blogged as much and blah, blah, blah. And what I'm living the worldview of UTOK, our vows. We had Rob Scott come and marry us, and our fundamental shift into UTOK's structure. And we shared in a lot of symbolism of that. That's the worldview. That's the sacred. That orients us at least toward the transcendent, towards how to have loving awareness of goodness, truth, and beauty underneath the concept of God, not an ontological statement, but the idea of an orientation towards that which is good. So the alpha, beta, gamma, zoom out as a philosophy, zoom or more specifically to metapsychology that frames this in a larger scientific view, and be aware that this is a languaging system that lives in the real. That has relevance to if you're fighting about something you're insecure about, and if you're thinking about what values are and think about how you should be. So all of that is sort of part of where UTOK is nested. And the one other thing I'll say, which really popped for me when I gave this, was I was starting to kind of come in when I came into IAM. And talk with Rob Smith. And it was well, what would you want to do? He's well, I would want to talk about a unified worldview initiative because I've been seeing, basically an integrated metatheory 2.0. That was essentially what I was saying. It's hey, we got to bring these systems together, start talking about it. Can we use AI to do this? How do we do this? That one thing led to another. I was then talking with Jim Rutt. God bless his soul, if you want to use that term. So Jim Rutt, of course, got sick and passed recently. But we were then discussing our particular views, and actually, that's when I was philosophy contains science, Jim. And I was arguing that's when the realization that actually we had lost the proper philosophical container for science when we reduced science and natural philosophy down into science. Like the institutional history of dropping natural philosophy into science meant that the ontological epistemological container was lost, okay, in essence, and the proper positioning of philosophy. And then, of course, I developed this thing called the natural philosophy frame. But morally, what that is doing is creating the proper territory institutionally for what? An alpha, beta, gamma fraternity. Right? I mean, that's what should have been happening is people could have gotten their PhD in alpha, beta, gamma metatheory. Like we should have all then, and we go out together, and this group, right, is the group that actually, like when we ask, how do we educate our children, right? And how do we organize the disciplines in relationship to each other? Ideally, this would be a very serious academic system that then says, hey, folks, here's how these metatheories actually, the metatheories come together, and this is how they put together the knowledge structures. So they're not siloed, but they're parts of a whole. They're integration. Here's this part. It's differentiated from this part, but it connects to the whole this way. Who can do this? And what's the right organization? Alpha, beta, gamma. Right? And that's simple, really. It's like, oh, you zoom out to philosophy, you take considerations of your axiological assumptions, your fundamental phenomenological assumptions, and an ontology epistemology, a metaphysical container for that, how it corresponds with empiricism. Oh, wait, we drop down to science. Science takes care of that. And all of that's got to be organized to hand to people and the modes of production and the lives and the values that people have in their everyday life. Well, those are the big three intersections. And we should have a freaking think tank. We should have academics that actually specialize in alpha, beta, gamma, right? Like that's, but we don't. I'm going to major in alpha, beta, gamma.
Well, at least we have the Institute of Applied Metatheory. That's
well, now we have applied meta. I mean, thank God for you guys, right? I mean, so now we have literally, and if we can be leaders in this and say this is, and you see Sean Carroll with the whole natural philosophy, you see him as a physicist sort of bumping into this and doing the Mindscape podcast and going, why don't we have a container for all this stuff? That's what he's hunting for with natural philosophy, and I think that's what we're really leading in many ways, and you guys in particular. So, so that's, I guess, my UTOK sort of backs into this. It finds in natural philosophy the large frame. It finds in psychology the way I plug to science. It finds in worldview sort of the life I'm living with Marcia, and then it invites conversation about all these three vectors with whatever other big theory meta theories are, and the way they're answering and adjusting and connecting to these vectors.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love everything you're saying there. And I mean, it takes us back to kind of the big picture of what we're doing here. We're actually just trying to uncover and clarify what a coherent worldview is, that we
Totally.
can live a good life by, that we can live that we can create a flourishing society by. And you can see how these kinds of distortions on the level of worldview or meta theory in a formal sense, they get sort of instantiated in the academy, and there are these kind of fundamental category errors. We don't actually understand that science is actually a subset of philosophy, and that creates practical problems in science that then downstream from that create sociological problems. And so we're actually trying to
we get somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson as, oh, he's now an intellectual leader, and I love a lot of what he says. He's a brilliant guy, but he was out there the other day saying, oh, I don't have beliefs. So he said. He claimed he did not have any beliefs because he was able to deduce all of his understanding of the world through a rational deductive process in relation, and that doesn't warrant the term belief. I was like, dude, I mean, that's a problem. Like,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
like all knowledge, like Plato's conception knowledge is justified true belief. Like that's one of the key ingredients. It's like unbelievable that we would be in a place where that's what I mean. Like when people think that science can supersede philosophy, we have made a horrible inversion of human knowledge.
And if you pay attention to Roy Boscar's arguments, I mean, he basically
he's the leader, right?
That like you necessarily have to have non-empirical presuppositions to even get a scientific inquiry going. For it to be possible and intelligible at all. And if you take that seriously, then you have to bow to philosophy a little bit. And likewise, philosophy has to bow to science in that it can uncover all the empirical nuances and substantive textures of the world. It all fits together. So anyway, this is beautiful. I guess that's maybe a tee up for your next question, Brendan. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, and kind of start to move towards a close here. Yeah, this has been such a rich, awesome discussion. Fantastic stuff. So yeah. and lots of things I could pick up from what you were just getting at, but really, really important stuff. And I just maybe quickly do want to underscore what you were getting at there, both of you, that these things have massive downstream consequences and effects, and this is not just a matter of highfalutin theory stuff hanging out in space. This directly informs the world that we wind up creating and co-inhabiting together. And so this, I think, again, just always keeps us coming back to the real world implications of the work that we're trying to do here and why it's important. But yeah, just in the last maybe 10 or so minutes here, one of the questions that we're going to be asking everyone talking about various models is sort of the limits and even weaknesses. So the question here, Greg, is you've been working on this model for so long and developing it and filling it out and all this. What's your sense right now of where those limits are for UTOK? What it stands to benefit from by being engagement with some other things that can supplement it with other ways of thinking, and yeah, maybe some of its current weaknesses or lack of completeness that this kind of enterprise of bringing these metatheories together can help correct for.
Yeah, it has a very strong epicenter on psychology. And so, and I'm kind of a lone wolf guy. I've been doing that. I'm a psychologist, I take the whole map to a geologist. I've done a geologist and looks at the tree of knowledge, and they're interested not in the complexification, they're interested in the aggregate pattern of an earth structure and the geochemistry. And they're like, well, we have all these answers, and this isn't relevant at all, really. Okay. I mean, it's useful maybe for my life in terms of I was just justifying something to my husband, but as a geologist, this isn't that useful. And therefore that's going to open up all sorts of specific kinds of questions that I am outlining here as to whether when you get to the experts, ask questions as like, is it really the case that this general GIST model holds, or are we really actually missing something that makes it a lot weaker than I think it is because of my ignorance? So that's a general issue. Like, know that the epicenter of this is pretty bound. One of the things that I always respected so much about Integral is how broad it got, and maintained a relatively coherent frame. I mean, what was he at, like 70 disciplines or even more or whatever? He was bringing in from people from a wide variety of different domains and jiving with that system. UTOK doesn't have that kind of backing or background or expansiveness. I think if you framed it right, it could, but it's not framed that way. So that's an open question. What do I really understand about fungi? That's a whole animal kingdom. I mean, a kingdom that sort of lives between plants and animals, and in terms of biomass, they're huge numbers and they're super intelligent in some weird ways, and I know nothing about them. So I'm completely ignorant about that. I don't know anything about markets. I don't know anything about, so I always just point to sort of the culture, and then society takes off 5,000 years ago, and then that binds the evolution of technology in another accelerating cycle relative to our culture person plane, and then you get really the sociology of society structures relative to, say, the anthropology of culture. And that brings in markets and government structures and really the industrialization and institutionalization of structure since the civilization. You need a lot of people to help me point to that type of stuff. So my cool thing is like, behavioral investment theory is an underlying investment structure that gets symbolized. Some money immediately becomes this. People are exchanging this because they can generalize this information rate of return on interest structures. Okay, now what? You can say a lot more about that if you have any real knowledge about economics, of which I don't. So to me, there's just all of these bands, and as an expert inside of, I have a lot of respect for David Chalmers. I think he's great. He's really interesting. But I read what he says about psychology, okay, as an inside expert, and like, you actually don't understand behaviorism or the evolution of cognitive thought. And that's the same thing with me. I'm like, I really like this transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics. Cool, but you don't really get the nuance of this relative to I don't do the math, so I'm outside. So I'm at least lucky enough to be an expert in an area, so I'll be very quickly humbled as soon as I step out. I know that I'm doing GIST stuff. So UTOK is doing GIST stuff on a lot of different domains and pointing to stuff that I think has coherence. But a huge limitation is, are the experts that would come in and allow the system to be open enough to listen to what the system says at, say, the GIST level of quantum mechanics to economics, and then want to participate in it, and see where the real limitations are. If there's certain errors that are in the core structure, then that would be painful. Obviously, that would need to be updated. But that's really the big question mark, and that's a limiting structure about where it is and where it's been, and those kinds of elements. So the other thing I'll say that's actually a potential, UTOK is so layered and multifaceted, and I spend all my time just building it. The cognitive load is just outrageous, really. I mean, it just takes relative to the return of payoff. It doesn't get it very adapted because it's just like, oh, trust me, learn all this shit and it will pay off. I'm telling you, I'm really excited about it. Well, that doesn't really, that's some people follow that, but a lot of people. I've always, but I mean, I'm a clinician. This whole thing starts with my clinician journey of human suffering and living adaptively versus maladaptively. Mossy and I are in the process of building what we call a new and better psychology. And it's grounded in this RAFTing model, which I'm quite excited about because it stands for relating, acting, feeling, and thinking. And RAFTing, the raft is process of mindedness. And so it actually then just immediately, hey, when you think of psychology, what do you think? Oh, it's lots of things. Actually, it's relating, acting, feeling, thinking. And then these are the common sense domains. And then you are navigating your world through a sensory navigation motor system. That's really what you're doing. And you do it non-consciously, and then you do it through a perspective, and then you do it through a narrative. Okay. We should be giving that to people as an orienting thing. We should have tools that enable them to navigate so they can see very clearly, I get sucked into neurotic whirlpools or shine a light on their raft so they can swim to more valued states of being. And that's what I would say sort of to us to be thinking about this. And I know, of course, a new story of wholeness is trying to do this, is like, this really makes a difference. And I'll end with this point that over the last 2 years have really clicked for me. And this is thanks to you, Brendan, and Nick, and you and Rob out there. Worldview is so important. It's such an important concept. And I just wasn't aware, although UTOK speaks to it, I wasn't aware that modernity lacks a coherent worldview. It just does. It doesn't afford us a way to bind what's real, how we know, what we value, and what we ought to do. It just doesn't. And when you really sit with that, you're like, oh, like how would we ever coordinate in a metastable global picture of the human structure that we are now in a globalized economy with AI and everything? How the possibly, if we can't answer a generalized operating system that gives us gist about what is real, how we know, what we should value, what we do, the absence of that is enormous relative to its presence, and I think we can get it. So fundamentally, this is a real, that's why I'd love to be participant in this, is like, hey, guys, this worldview thing's unbelievably important. It's unbelievably real. What I'm doing with psychology now is trying to say, here's how it translates into your life of relating, thinking, feeling. If other people are doing that, and for economic purposes, other people are doing it for environmental structures, general values towards flourishing, Nick, with visionary realism, we all kind of like say, hey, this is how we're missing a worldview. This is our opportunity to solve this. And this is what it means for better living relative to the way the world's going. Well, what else, what's meaningful? What's a meaningful project, Brendan? Huh? That's at least for me, that's a meaningful project. And so I think that's what we can try to work towards doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, you almost kind of answered the last question I was going to ask you, implicitly in that. I mean, one could say that the absence of a coherent worldview that really honors, the wholeness of reality and links together our understanding of what's real, what we know, what we value, and what we ought to do. That is the fundamental driver of the meta crisis. That is the meta crisis behind the poly crisis, right? And so that's what we are each trying to do here. You with UTOK system, my visionary realism. We've got a whole bunch of other amazing integrated meta theories in the space. And I think what is amazing to me is that we all have, I think, enough epistemic humility, and I want to appreciate you for your epistemic humility that you just demonstrated in what you shared, to come to the table and be like, well, this isn't, a perfect, complete system. We're here to evolve it, and we need each other. And the age of the lone wolf metatheorist is over, as we like to say. So, I mean, all that's to say, is there anything else you'd like to, I was going to ask you about the meta crisis and how you talk. Let's say someone is not necessarily deep into the scientific domains that you're in or the philosophical questions you're in. They're just more of someone who's interested in the meta crisis. What would you say to that person about, like, how is UTOK relevant for addressing the meta crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it would say very similar to what you're saying. There's a lot that's going on, a lot of changes going on, and it basically, it even immediately says, actually, when you get novel information processing communication networks, you open up new spaces, both for huge potential for change, but a lot of opportunity for chaos and change. Oh, by the way, what's the AI tipping point? It's actually immediately interfacing culture person justification, human natural intelligence with artificial intelligence. That's like a potential for a huge transformation. And that huge transformation will undermine all the other structures, okay, of containment. Again, that's a potential issue, but it also opens up massive issues for chaos attractors or hyper order contractors that respond to them. And then how we do this wisely, given especially all the poly crises, okay, is a real question. The ultimate route, though, the argument of the ultimate route is we will be much better off if we have a coherent operating system, like that we actually understand the basic structure of the world, our place in it, and what we value and why. Like that's shared, like in a broad sense. And I would argue this. So, I'd not get too political or whatever, but fundamentally, modernity had for a long time, a good enough common sense understanding. It, of course, undermines Christianity in a particular way and gives rise to a common sense set of axioms and understandings about what is good and how institutions will help people and what we can expect and what we can value and all this other stuff. And somebody like Bill Clinton represents sort of a golden age of that optimism and potential, okay, especially within America, all right? But I believe that modernity, if we go back to what we were seriously saying, if modernity, in terms of the way it treats religion and science and human consciousness, does not have a worldview, it doesn't really bind these domains together, but instead sort of patches them together, okay, as a system that then is very vulnerable to cracking, to malformed complexification, to manipulation, to mistrust, because it doesn't really do, then what happens? And my interpretation of Donald Trump, okay, the phenomenon of Donald Trump and what he represents is that actually what's really going on is the lowest common denominator is an ego power move. That's actually really, if you listen to modernity, at the end of the day, money, industrial political power and influence for your ego is what matters. Okay, there's a great book by Barry Schwartz called The Battle for Human Nature, and he argues that implicit in modernity, absent a coherent vision, and it's not right, but is a selfish, egotistical, instrumental control structure that then utilizes the basic powers that science affords to gratify your self-position. Well, does that sound familiar? Right? I mean, it really is just sort of like a realization. Why do people feel like Trump is so authentic? Because I think that basically underneath it all is that really what it is an instrumental ego. That's what we really are. And that's what he then manifests. That's not what we really are. like that's wrong. It's a default in the absence of coherent understanding. And then we get mirrored back to us. He's a mirror to us that says, this is actually what you were hiding. This is actually what you actually suppose you are, even though that's actually not what we are. And if we really understood what we are, we would be in a much better place. So I'd like to think of Trump as something we can use and say, hey, that's the symptom of a much deeper notion. And we can flip. I even use the idea that we can go from Trump's true social, which really is this justifying egoic mechanism. Just listen to his text. Just go to that. They're all an algorithm. I am great, and everybody that opposes me is a loser. That's all it says every time, right? And in increasingly dramatic ways at various ways. That's what it is. It's just an algorithm. True social. I'm going to justify why I'm great, and you support me. Okay? Social truth. People justify. They justify for influence and investment. That's what we do. That's a process by which we, let's wake up to the fact that we're justifying apes. Okay? That's the ontology. Rather than just to leave that transparently with ego defensiveness, let's wake up to that. And let's share in that. That's okay. That doesn't mean we're bad. It just means that's what we are. So a social truth transformation would be, wait a minute, that didn't go well. That's not going well at the polycrisis level. It's not going well because we're missing the fundamental operating system. We can use Trump to see what happens when the fundamental operating system is missing because it reduces to power and ego. And then we can actually use him as a way to attend to that and say, actually, this is what we are. And if you go back to indigenous people, I'll say one last thing, everyone, all the indigenous people actually get that the first thing we do is try to contain the Trumps of the world. That's actually their organization fundamentally is managing narcissism. That's one of the most important things that indigenous people do. And so anyway, that's what I would. That's one way reflection then about where we are and where we might go.
That's a really powerful analysis, Greg. I really found that to be really illuminating. So thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for this whole taking the time to talk with us and all the work that you've done to develop this amazing system.
Hey man, I love it. Yeah, I appreciate it.
This has been great. Thank you so much, Greg. Really appreciate it. And I'll just underscore that last point of knowing who we are is so key. And even goes back to the depths of philosophy and know thesauton, know thyself. And if we're faltering on that in a major way, then that's going to have huge downstream consequences. So I echo what Nick said, and this has been great. Thank you both. This has been really, really rich, and thanks, Greg, for all the work that you're doing, and really looking forward to continuing to engage your model and bring it together with these others.
Great, man. You guys are doing what's absolutely necessary to create this ecology for us to come together in dialogue. So I deeply, deeply appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, man.
The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.